Hi, my name is Ashley Llanes. I am a postgraduate resident here at the Torpedo Factory. A little bit about me. I was born and raised in Miami, Florida, and I moved here about 4 years ago to get my bachelor's in fine art photography. Past works and important themes for me are my Cuban American identity and coming from a very traditional family with gender roles and expectations. And being queer and how that is not really seen as something acceptable in my family, as well as coming from a very religious family. I am very drawn to the aesthetics of it, and the sacred geometry is something that I'm very, very inspired by, as well as the themes of sacrifice, healing, forgiving, reconciliation. But I like to use it in a context that is less guilt-inflicting, but more therapeutic. Something that led me to the path that I'm on now is this discovery of found objects and favorite objects, and objects that have lived a lifetime, or something that I just see on the street that I find fascinating and I want to keep. And I took that a step further, and going on this investigation with my parents and seeing what their upbringing looked like through photographs, and understanding or just becoming curious and starting to investigate what their upbringing looked like, and asking questions about it, and then knowing more about myself through their history, which is my history by default. And it just became more relatable, and I understand myself more profoundly through that. And where I currently am at is dissecting the term intergenerational trauma, which is very much the key to the work that I am currently processing. And that term is the transference of trauma and between generations. This piece you see on the left is one of the first pieces that I made with this concept in mind, and it addresses my upbringing, my father's upbringing, my grandfather's upbringing, and with the use of both found objects, favorite objects from my childhood, and my young adulthood. I'd like to introduce the concept of isolecise, which is the title of this piece, or this series that I'm currently working on in this residency. And it is the Latin term for separate islands, and it is coined by psychoanalysts Semino and Corial. It's really important for me because it not only explains this idea of damaged structures and an alienating identity, how communication works in a body of separate islands, and that obviously reminds me of the Caribbean islands as soon as I hear that. My full approach to this investigation for intergenerational trauma is looking at the past, the present, and the future. The past is broken down into two parts. The past is the past, as in the history, and past, which will be your upbringing. The past is very much this external investigation, I'd like to call it, because it's something that you have to go outside of yourself for. It's something you have to read up on. It's something you have to ask your parents, your grandparents about. You have to look for photos. It requires physical, mental, emotional labor, and not just something that you can will out of internal thinking. But it also requires this attitude of empathy that is really important. I don't think, without that lens, I don't think it's very possible to understand what even the history is. that leads me to the last bullet point, which is learning and accepting the fact that with that history that you are absorbing and investigating, you just have to accept that that is the circumstances of your existence, and that history is your history, and it's what circumstances you have been given. To the right, this is an example of a photo of my father that I used with a few different magazines. I use magazines from Cuban, this Cuban series. It's called La Bohemia. That's Bohemia. They were very popular in the 1950s, and I was able to thrift them in Miami, but they're also, you can also purchase them online. I draw a lot of inspiration from them. So for my upbringing, which is also, it is a combination between an external investigation and an internal one. For example, like looking at a photo of, like that one to the left with my sister and I in rainbow shirts. Like I may remember half of that day, but if I show it to my mom or my father, they're going to have a much more detailed story of what I acted like, and I'll remember what I felt like. I will say that this, since it starts to involve your own personal history and feelings, it starts to become more difficult to remove that lens of empathy. Also, looking at your early education and what your access to information was at the time, especially given the circumstances of whatever conditions you were brought up in, is very important to look at. Very important to understand, as well as whatever early invalidating experiences you had. And it's important, very important, to try to validate those things now. So next we have the present, and this is a completely internal process. It requires an inventory and this accountability that only you and solely you can do, where you have to list what you have been improving versus what you still need to work on, what you are willing to work on, what seems surmountable. It's also helpful to look at your coping mechanisms, which ones are healthy, which ones are not, which ones you're willing to stop doing, which ones you're willing to, which ones are, again, insurmountable. Lastly, we have the future, and this is also both a internal and external process. I think the most important thing about this step is the word relinquishing. It's another word, relinquishing is another word for forgiveness, but I think I like to use relinquishing because it has a better and less negative connotation. And another very important term here is debriefing trauma for others and self, which requires social vulnerability and an idea of collective healing, which is currently in the works. For my process, I am putting a collective healing group together. And this book to my left is where I have sourced most of my information from when I was first curious about this subject. It just gave me the tools that I needed and answered most, if not all, my questions. And here to the right is the altar in my studio in 319 here at the Torpedo Factory. And you can see my work at my website, ashyanes.com, and my Insta handle is at seldom followed. Thank you so much for tuning in.